Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast. So glad you are joining us. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever been in a situation where maybe you were around a group of people or a particular person, and when you walked away from that setting, you felt kind of worthless? You just felt worthless about yourself in some way. Maybe you're around another group of Christians and they just seem to be more passionate, more excited, and closer to Jesus than you, and you just walked away and go, man, I just kind of feel worthless as a Christ follower. Have you ever been around maybe that perfect parent who has the perfect kids, and then you walk away and you go, man, I'm kind of worthless as a parent? Maybe you were a church leader and you were at a church conference and you're around all these other great mega leaders and all kinds of great stories and statistics, and then you just walked away feeling like, oh man, I'm kind of worthless. Why am I even doing what I'm doing? I know personally, I've been in those situations where I walked away from a conference feeling less about myself than when I first went there. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I think all of us, if we aren't careful, do encounter those feelings of worthless. Now, last week I shared about the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle rookie card that it had auctioned off for $2.8 million, the best graded card that is known of. $2.8 million. Now, that's a very valuable card, and I have now in my hand a 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle. Man, you're like, wow, that's got to be worth all kinds of money. Well, this particular one I'm holding in my hand is actually worthless. Well, what do you mean it's worthless? Well, it's not an original 1952 Mickey Mantle. This is actually a copy of a 1952 Mickey Mantle. Therefore, it's actually worthless. So let's talk about the feelings of worthless. When we compare ourselves to other people and try to copy and emulate other people, we actually have feelings of worthless, because a copy is always worth less than the original. So whenever you begin to feel worthless, when you begin to doubt your self-worth, so to speak, just ask yourself this question. Is it because you're comparing yourself to somebody else and you feel pressured to have to be like them, behave like them, lead like them, talk like them, parent like them? Because when you compare yourself to someone else and try to become someone else, the reality is this: you're becoming a copy of someone else and not true to the original of who God made you to be. And the byproduct of that is you're always going to feel worthless. Now, in God's eyes, you're never worthless, but you can have feelings of worthless when you live your life trying to be a copy of somebody else, another leader, another pastor, another volunteer, another parent, another spouse. Be who God made you to be, not a copy of someone else. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." Just a side note, we aren't saved by good works. We're saved for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. I want to unpack two words from this passage. First, workmanship. The English word poem we get from this Greek word workmanship. What God is telling us through the Apostle Paul is that you're a one-of-a-kind poem. You're a one-of-a-kind masterpiece created by God. Now, that word created in the Greek gives the idea of something that is copyrighted, patented, or trademarked. When God made you, he made you a one-of-a-kind masterpiece. He liked it so much that he broke the mold, said there'll never be another you. I'm going to copyright that, trademark it, and patent it so that there can only be one you. You were never made to be somebody else. We learn from others. We can learn principles. We can learn systems, strategies, structures. We can fine-tune and we can improve. But at the end of the day, you are to be the unique you that God made you to be. So what makes this so hard is that we live in a culture and society where we're really pressured to blend in. We're pressured to be like everybody else. And when we aren't like everybody else, when our church isn't like every other church, because somebody always comes in and goes, well, they did it this way at my last church. Well, if you liked it better, then go back to the last church, because God hasn't called us to be that church. God has called us to be this church. And then when you show up to hang out with a group of friends, maybe they all have a particular name brand label that you have to have, and you have to fit in through a particular style of dress to fit into that group of people, because if you don't fit into that group of people, then you stand out, and they point out that you stand out and you don't fit in. Our whole culture wants to conform us pretty much in every way to be like them. But the problem is this: when you're like everybody else and you fit into everybody else's mold, you are truly a copy of somebody else and not true to who God made you to be. And then you're always going to be struggling with this feeling of worthless, because you're caught up in the cycle of compare sin. And when you look at the word compare a sin, it's compare a sin. It's a sin to compare. I struggled with this pretty much my whole life. And I'm going to be honest, I'm 50 years old now, and I still struggle with this at times. And I'll probably struggle with this till the day Jesus takes me home. I think most of us as human beings always wrestle this in some way or another. When I was a child, I really didn't fit into any one group of people. I tried to fit into this group, and I wasn't either smart enough, or I didn't have enough money to fit into this particular group. I wasn't athletic enough to hang out with the jocks. And I always struggled with not feeling like I fit in. But as I've grown older, what I've discovered is the very things that caused me to stand out are the unique things that God created me for what I do now today. When I look at all the things that I have to do as a pastor, leading a large staff, leading a large church that's beginning to have influence on a global scale, here's what I've realized. The things that caused me to stand out and made me insecure as a kid are the very same characteristics that I need, that God gave, that help me do the things that I do today. What would have happened if I spent my whole life trying to be like everybody else? I know right now I would not be in front of you, or you wouldn't be listening to this podcast had I spent my life becoming a copy of somebody else. I remember back in Bible college, in fact, I didn't fit in Bible college. I struggled even with some of my classes because the way I saw things, the way I thought church could be, should be, I just didn't fit into certain environments. I remember I was a straight A student. I worked hard. But I remember there were 2 classes I didn't get A's in. In fact, I got a B in one class, and it was evangelism. The reason I got B in evangelism was because I disagreed with some of the things that my teacher would put onto the tests regarding evangelism. I would answer the questions as I thought they should be, not the way he wanted them to be. And so I always got into these debates, couldn't win. I was right. I still think he was wrong, but he gave me the B. Now, I find it amusing because here now, almost 30 years later, I've led over 50,000 people to Jesus Christ, and I had a B in evangelism. I go, that was the best B I ever had. I'm glad I stuck with my convictions and approach versus trying to fit into the mold of a class. The second grade that I got that wasn't an A was actually a C, and that was in youth ministry. And I find that really funny. I was actually going through some papers, and I came across this not long ago. I'd forgotten about it, but I got a C. And the reason I had gotten a C in youth ministry was because the teacher leading the class had never led a youth group over 100. Now, nothing wrong with that. A lot of great youth ministries that aren't necessarily large, but she had a particular way of thinking this is how you do youth ministry. Well, I always pushed against the boundaries and go, what if? I was the kid that was always coloring outside the lines when it came to how we could and should do youth ministry. And so, as a result, I got a C. Now, I'm reminded of that statement that says the A students work for the C students, because I was the C student in youth ministry. And by the grace of God, more in spite of me than because of me, I got to lead youth ministry for 15 years and was part of a great church in helping build the largest youth ministry in the nation, where when I had left, we had 3,000 students attending that youth ministry every single week and saw tens of thousands of kids come to Christ. I go, again, that was a beautiful C. I'm glad I stuck with who God made me to be a little bit out of the box, because it paid great dividends in the long run. If you spend your whole life trying to fit in, trying to conform, you are going to feel like this Mickey Mantle card. Yes, you may look good, but at the end of the day, it's just a copy and it's truly worthless. God created you to be incredibly valuable in His big picture of what He wants to do in you and through you as a leader, as a dad, as a mom, as a spouse, as a volunteer inside of your church. So learn from others, but don't copy others. Be who God made you to be. Join us next week as we continue the All Out Leadership podcast. We're going to be looking at what I call the Midas standard of leadership inside of Scripture, and we're going to start an exciting series next week. Look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.